So, My Hero Academia manga chapter 335 has officially released, and let's just say that, yeah, this chapter does heavily hint at who the traitor is. And in this video, I want to go over a little bit on why this person may actually be the traitor, and also make a few predictions on what's going to be happening with the traitor plotline in the next few chapters. And we'll get right into that. But first, we'll do it right after this. Hey guys, how's it going? It's your boy, Manga Man Drew, and I'm here to do my manga discussion for My Hero Academia, manga chapter 335, titled Zygotes. And yeah, it's titled Zygotes. I mean, that makes sense, but I feel as if fletchling was probably a more apt understanding of what this chapter is. But when it comes to this chapter of My Hero Academia, what I said in the review pretty much is still accurate with what we have officially with the official chapter. So in this video, I'm going to go over a slight few differences between the official and unofficial translations. But for most of this video, I want to go into the traitor, who they possibly are, the little bits of evidence that we saw that leads to this point in the story for this person being the traitor, and what we will see later on in the story about the traitor plotline, because it's not necessarily confirmed that this character is a traitor, but it is heavily implied that they are. So, before we get into the discussion proper, I'd like to ask you, if you haven't done so, to subscribe to my YouTube channel. We've almost hit 1,000 subscribers. I can't wait to meet that milestone. So, if you like my type of content, when I talk about the spoilers, discussions, and all of that about My Hero Academia, you should subscribe to my YouTube channel so that you can be notified whenever I upload more content like this. And it would make me very happy. So, thank you if you did. So, we'll start off with the differences between the official and unofficial translations, and for the most part, relatively speaking, they are the same. There are some slight differences that can change the perception of where the story is going, so I'll talk about those. Probably a minute difference is the title change between Zygotes and Fletchlings, and I think Fletchlings makes more sense for what we actually learn about this chapter, about how the students are like birds that weren't ready to fly yet, but now they're ready to soar on their own. I think that makes more sense than Zygotes, which isn't inaccurate, it just doesn't feel right to me. But now going into the differences, one difference between the official and unofficial translations comes from after All Might is telling the students about Star and Stripe and the information that he got from the pilots. In the unofficial translation, he talks about how they got information about New Order and how it's a poison, and how they cannot definitively know how many quirks were destroyed. But actually in the official translation, it doesn't say that they don't know how many quirks were destroyed, nor does it say that they do know or they don't know about All For One's quirks. So this could mean that they could have a list of quirks that are inside of All For One. I'm going to temper my expectations for that. If it does happen, cool, and if not, that's fine. All we know is that they were able to get the information from the pilots to the kids, because this is some information that really they wouldn't know unless it wasn't for the fact that the pilots were able to gather the information. So it's good that they know that now. And then another slight difference that we get from this chapter comes from what Bakugo says after he reveals to All Might that the kids have been training, which it makes sense that they have been training. We did see that they are using new moves that they didn't use in the war. So you could have implied that they were doing some type of training in between that time. Even though we don't necessarily see it, it's very likely that we could get them training a little bit more in the next few chapters. But the difference between the official and unofficial translation comes from what Bakugo says about Deku and what Deku says. Because in the unofficial translation, you have Deku saying that Kachan specifically said that he's going to help him master All For One, and then Bakugo chimes in about how he wants to use his new technique cluster, and we don't get an explanation for what the cluster move is. But in the official translation, you have Deku saying that, oh yeah, they're going to spar with me, so help me complete One For All, where Bakugo has this retort, and then Bakugo immediately says that he just wants to test his new cluster moves on Deku, because if they can work on Deku, they can most likely work on Shigaraki and All For One. So the difference is that he doesn't just have one technique or one move, but he has multiple new moves that involve his new cluster explosion. So it makes a little bit more sense for him to have new techniques involving cluster instead of just having the new technique be cluster and we just don't know the name of it. So it could be that his new moves could just be updated versions of his older moves with cluster, like cluster howitzer or cluster X catapult. It could be something like that, and it'll probably be a lot harder and pack a lot more of a punch. So it's going to be cool to see if we're going to see that in the next few chapters, or if we're going to see it within the final battle. And then the final difference that actually comes in this chapter between the official and unofficial translation comes from All For One, and how he's talking about Shigaraki, where Shigaraki is like writhing in pain. He's very itchy, most likely because he doesn't have the ability to destroy, where you have in the official translations, you have him saying that, all right, our consciousness are almost fused. I can feel his hatred, which is completely different from what is stated in the unofficial fan translations, which is alluding to the idea that their consciousnesses are fused. So it does mean that it will take a week for Shigaraki and All For One inside of Shigaraki to fuse and become this one new entity, which actually in reality makes a little bit more sense, because it means that 100% actually does mean that his body is completed as well as his mind being fused, or it could be that his body is already completed and it needs to heal because of his quirk factor being damaged or being strained, and that he needs this time for it to heal, as well as for All For One and Shigaraki to finally combine inside of Shigaraki. So that is a difference, and it does tie more into what the official says and all the information that we know than with the unofficial. And now that we've talked about the differences, I want to talk more about the traitor, or who the traitor potentially is and what role they could be playing in the story moving forward. So, as many people have probably heard, the traitor of UA most likely is Toru Hagakure, the Invisible Girl. And for what we've seen at the end of this chapter, it heavily implies that Hagakure is the traitor. And the reason why I say implies is because we've done something similar to this nature when it comes to another character, aka Aoyama, where at the end of the chapter we see Aoyama doing something very like suspicious and seeming to be potentially traitor-like, where we then immediately learn that it wasn't because he was a traitor, he's just very weird and he really connected with Deku. So it could be possible that this could be a red herring, but I highly doubt that is going to be the case, mainly due to the fact that there is a fair amount of evidence that leads to Toru Hagakure actually being the traitor. And I would love to explain it all to you, but I think that there are two different sources that you can go to that pretty much explains it a lot better than I could. There's actually a Reddit post that I'm probably going to link down in the description down below that you can read that could give you a lot of evidence pointing to Toru Hagakure potentially being the traitor, as well as a video from a favorite YouTuber of mine, Joyboy Theories, who did a review about Toru being the traitor. So I'm going to link it somewhere over there. But to give a general gist of what was stated in the video as well as the subreddit, there's some evidence pointing to the fact that Hagakure is most likely the traitor. One evidence is the fact that she potentially lied about her being with both Todoroki and Ojiro during the USJ invasion by the villains. How she said that she was transported with Ojiro but was able to see what Shoto did, which doesn't make sense because they were in two different locations by themselves. As well as the fact that there was no clear identification on where she was with both her and Aoyama, as well as the fact that if you see where the heroes and the kids were sent when Kurogiri used the warp, there is no physical way that she could have ended up in the same location as Ojiro or Shoto based off the manga panel, as well as even in the anime. And then another piece of evidence that was shown that most likely says that Toru is the traitor comes from when the kids are doing the vote for the class president, where if you look at the tallies and the names that got votes, you would see that there were 18 people that were voted into positions and that there were 19 votes casted. And we know who casted who. Everyone got pretty much one vote because they voted for themselves. The only exceptions was both Momo and Deku, where it is confirmed that Ida and Uraraka voted for Deku and that Shoto voted for Momo and everyone else voted for themselves, but the only missing person that didn't vote was Hagakure. And during this chapter, this is the same chapter that Shigaraki invaded UA, and when the villains most likely got the information about who was going to be at the USJ for them to actually do the invasion. So those are pieces of information that points to Hagakure being the villain, but I think probably the funniest foreshadowing that I saw was this panel right here, where we literally see Hagekure, Invisible Girl, during their first training exercise being placed as a villain, which, if that was the case, that's just very funny foreshadowing to me, showing that it was most likely the intention for her to be the traitor from the beginning. So, if we go with the idea that Toru Hagekure is the villain or is the traitor, now let's theorize on why that may be the case, because I think that's a big reason why people don't like the fact that Toru Hagekure is the traitor, as well as potentially the idea that she isn't a very developed character and that we as the readers don't really care about her. To my response would be, when it comes to a traitor, the readers don't necessarily have to care about the traitor himself or herself. What is more important is how the traitor affects the kids, affects the other characters. And when it comes to Toru Hagekure, or really anyone in Class 1A, if it was ever revealed that anyone in Class 1A is the traitor, no matter if we got a lot of development or no development at all, it would still be impactful to the characters because these students have spent a lot of time together. Because people would argue that, oh, we haven't seen anything from her, but in actuality, we have. We've seen a lot of smaller interactions between her and Ojiro. We've also seen like interactions either in the manga or in the anime between Toru as well as her other female classmates, especially when she as well as Ashiro were playing together, teasing Ochako about her crush on Deku. As well as we've just seen her have like these smaller moments with the students, so at the very least, she has built a connection with the students in the class. So even though the traitor reveal from our perspective is not that great, it is going to be heavily weighed on the students because of how much time they spend together. We also have to remember that these are the same kids that literally fought villains together, almost died multiple times together, literally ate and slept under the same roof. It doesn't matter if we didn't really get a whole lot of development for her personally. We've seen them grow as a cast, grow as people together, and the fact that one of them is a traitor is going to weigh heavily, especially when you tie in this one line from All Might, who believes that none of the students can be the traitor. And it's gonna hit harder for the students and the characters if someone that they viewed as a friend and a comrade is eventually shown to be a villain. It's very similar to what we've seen in other traitor reveals, spoilers for One Piece and Bleach, where a traitor in One Piece within the 9-rib Scabbards was revealed to be Kanjuro, and even though we didn't get a lot with Kanjuro, there was a lot of foreshadowing for him being the traitor, but what was more impactful is how the characters reacted to him. How Kinemon cuts him down immediately even though he's a friend, or even the fact that Okiku, even though knowing he's a traitor, was still unable to hurt him, which led to her perceived death. And when it comes to Bleach, when it comes to the traitors, Sosuke Aizen, Gin Ichimaru, and Kaname Tozen, they really didn't leave a lasting impression on us when we were perceiving them as the traitors. But the impact came more from how the characters reacted and how the characters felt about them being traitors, specifically when it comes to characters like the Lieutenant and the characters that cared about them, like Rangiku, like Shuhei, like Momo. It impacted them more, most likely, than it impacted the readers. It might have been a bigger surprise, but we really didn't have that much of a connection with them. But the characters within the story that we would eventually build or already built a connection with them would be impacted more by the fact that they are traitors. So I don't think that her being revealed as the traitor, even though it is predictable, is necessarily a bad thing. It's what is going to be used, but what's going to really play into whether or not this traitor reveal or her as a traitor is going to be good is how it affects the other characters. Because you could have had the reveal be Aoyama or Kaminari, and that would be very shocking because we've grown attachment to them, but I would say that it would make a lot less sense within story than it would when it comes to the character of Invisible Girl, aka Hagekure. And now, let's talk about what can be done with Hagekure and her connection with All For One and being the traitor. And there are many ways that you can really take it. If it's just that she's evil for evil's sake, I mean, cool. She could be like an unredeemable villain like Kanjuro in One Piece, where even though she was pretending this entire time that she never gets repentment. She never really is sorry for what she does, which will be something very interesting because it means that it will end the series with one less member in Class 1A, and that even though she may like be defeated, she may not necessarily be saved because she's pure evil. I think that that is probably the less likely thing because the story is focusing on the idea that villains can be saved. So I think most likely an idea that I have for her is that she's gonna appear to be like the pure evil archetype, but that she does have a very deeper meaning for being with All For One. She may have a debt with All For One where All For One saved her and she owes him a debt of gratitude, and then she later learned how horrible All For One is. That is a possibility. Or what is even more interesting is that maybe All For One gave her a quirk that forced her to be invisible, or even better, maybe All For One promised her that if she sided with him, that she would have her invisibility taken away. Because we really don't know how her powers work. Maybe she can make her own clothes invisible. Maybe she can make herself visible at any time, which would apply to that idea that she was always evil from the start. But I would like the idea that she probably decided to go with All For One because she realized that All For One would have been the only one that allowed her to be seen. Because if we believe that she was born with an invisibility quirk, that means that she probably had a very difficult life due to the fact that she existed in a world that could never see her. And that could be a reflection of how the story has never really focused on her. So we could have this revelation that the reasoning why she did this is because she wanted to like literally be seen, and wanted to be seen as normal because she always lived a life where she could never stand out because no one could ever see her. And that eventually you will have characters, probably this would be cheesy, but they will say, yo, we've always seen her, we've always accepted you for who you are, you don't need to change. And that could lead to her switching sides, or her just not going back to the class, feeling guilty about what she did, and no longer returning to the class, no longer returning to All For One, and that she takes herself out of the story to come back at a later date. So there are a few ways to take the character of Hagakure, but from what we're seeing, it doesn't matter which way that we go, we're going to get a little bit more character development from her, or at least a little bit more character growth, where I fall under the camp of the idea that not every single character in a story can or should get character development, but I think that a lot of characters should grow as characters, not necessarily learning about their backstory or where they are from, but seeing how they change throughout the story, either for the better or for the worse. And I can see with Hagakure that no matter where the story goes, it's going to change her for the better. And I think this change will also affect other characters in Class 1A, specifically Shoji and Ojiro. Because I think it's going to affect Shoji because in this chapter, we see that he brings up this idea that there are people more than what was listed that could be villains. And usually when Hirokoshi has that background with a white light behind it, it means that this is something that you should pay attention to. So I think that most likely what's going to happen is that Shoji is going to be the person to reveal Hagakure as being the traitor, and is either going to try and go against her and fight her, where it's going to be a test of his senses versus her invisibility, where it could lead to her learning that she can completely hide her presence, to the point where we will get a buff with Ojiro where he'll be able to find someone whose presence is completely hidden, which would be cool. And it could lead to not necessarily Deku convincing her to stay, but having Shoji to do it, because he's probably one of the very few male students that has like an actual like more meaningful connection with Hagakure. Or tying into the second person that could play a role in bringing Hagakure back or actually fighting her would be Ojiro, because if you've paid attention to Ojiro in the story, and I know that's very difficult, you will see that the character, or the female character he probably talks to the most, is actually Hagakure. Because every time you really see Hagakure talking to like a male student, It's not always Ojiro, but she has talked to him the most. So I think most likely what is going to happen over the next few chapters is that we're going to get a little bit more into why Hagakure was the traitor, her motives for doing it, her connection with All for One, and that we're eventually going to get either Shoji, Ojiro, or both confronting her about that and either convincing her to stay and that she may provide information to the students about where All for One is. Or they may fight her and she may get away, and that they're going to be the ones to convey the information to the other students about her betrayal, which is going to be very impactful to them, but it could be used to take advantage of this idea and allowing them to counter All for One by either using the fact that Hagakure has left and tracking her to All for One's location, or if they get her to be brought into the fold and to admit her fault, then they could use her to gather a little bit more information about All for One and potentially lead to them having a plan with this information from the traitor and use it to defeat All for One later on in the story. So yeah, that's pretty much all the thoughts that I have about the chapter, predicting what's going to happen, giving my reasons most likely why it makes sense that Hagakure is a traitor, and giving my explanations on what's going to be happening in the next few chapters involving her character growth, her character development, and the involvement of other characters such as Shoji and Ojiro. Because here's the thing, the reveal isn't complete. Even though we as the readers know that she is potentially the traitor, the students don't know, and we have to see and wait a little bit longer on how this is going to play out. Because I do not think that this is an amazing chapter, but I do think that this chapter is setting up for a little bit more for us to see, if not the next few chapters within the war itself. So yeah, that's all I really have to say about this chapter. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and if you did, why not leave a like on this video and show that you really like this content. And let me ask you a question. Do you think that Hagakure could be redeemed, or do you even think that she is the traitor? Leave your thoughts down in the comments down below. I would really like to read them. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button and hit the notification button to be notified for whenever I upload more content like this. Do all that cool jazz, and hopefully I'll be able to catch you in my next video. Goodbye!